They found her skull in the riverbed, or what they think was hers. More than 100 human skulls pulled from the mud of the Walbrook, a stream that once cut through the heart of Roman London, long since buried under the modern city's foundations. Nobody knows for certain whose skulls they are. Nobody knows exactly how they got there. But the date stamped into the soil around them is unmistakable. Around 60 AD. The year the city burned. The year a woman led an army of over 100,000 warriors across southeastern Britain, torched 3 cities to the ground, killed somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people, destroyed an entire Roman legion, and came within a single battle of driving the greatest empire the world had ever seen off the island of Britain forever. Her name was Boudica, and if you live in London today, you are walking over the ashes she left behind. Right now, buried beneath the financial district, beneath the banks, the trading floors, the glass towers of the modern city of London, there is a layer of scorched red and black earth, roughly 10 to 30 centimeters thick. Archaeologists call it the Boudican Destruction Horizon. It runs under Gracechurch Street, under Cornhill, under the old line of the Walbrook, under the site of the Bloomberg European headquarters, where workers found intact Roman streets in 2013, along with a temple to the Persian god Mithras and wooden writing tablets, personal notes, business letters, trade records, left by people who had no idea that within a few years, their entire world would be incinerated. One of those tablets is dated 57 AD, 3 years before the fire. Someone was asking about the price of goods. That person almost certainly died in the flames. Their note survived under the ash. This is what Boudica did. And to understand how it happened, how a single woman brought the Roman Empire to the edge of abandoning an entire province, you have to go back to a world that most people have completely forgotten. A world that existed before London existed. A world of tribal kings and client kingdoms, of Roman greed and catastrophic miscalculation, of a family humiliated in the most savage way imaginable, and of a revenge so total that 2,000 years later, it is still detectable in the ground beneath your feet. Londinium, the city Boudica destroyed, was not ancient when she burned it. It was barely a decade old. The Romans had founded it sometime around 47 to 50 AD, in the years following Emperor Claudius's invasion of Britain in 43 AD. Before that, the site was nothing remarkable. Wooded hills above the floodplain of the Thames, a few scattered Iron Age farmsteads, some small streams running down to the river. No major settlement, no significance. The Romans chose the location for purely practical reasons. It sat at the lowest point of the Thames where a bridge could be built and large ships could still reach the bank. Roads could radiate outward in every direction. Goods could flow in from the continent and be distributed across the province. It was, in short, the perfect hub for an empire that ran on logistics. What followed was one of the most explosive periods of urban growth in the ancient world. Within a decade, Londinium had somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 inhabitants. Merchants had come from Gaul, Spain, North Africa, the Rhineland, the Middle East. Analysis of skeletal remains from Roman-era cemeteries beneath the city reveals a population of almost impossible diversity for the ancient world. People from across the entirety of the Roman Empire living and dying in this wooden town on the edge of the known world. The port was already one of the busiest in the province. There was piped water, there was a planned street grid. There was, according to Tacitus, writing just a few decades later, a place so commercially vibrant that by 60 AD it had become famous, a celebrated center of trade, overflowing with merchants. This was the city Boudica would reduce to a layer of ash. But first, there was a kingdom to the northeast that Rome had decided it no longer needed to respect. The Iceni were not savages. They were not some primitive tribe cowering in the forests while civilization marched past. They had their own coinage, some of the earliest known British coins. They had trade connections to the continent. They had a warrior aristocracy, a functioning political structure, a king. Their territory covered what is now the county of Norfolk and parts of the surrounding areas, rich agricultural land, productive, organized, capable of fielding a serious army when necessary. They had already demonstrated this in 47 AD, when they briefly revolted against a Roman disarmament order and had been permitted to retain a measure of independence once the uprising was suppressed. Their king, Prasutagus, had spent his reign walking the most dangerous tightrope in the ancient world, keeping the Iceni semi-independent while maintaining just enough loyalty to Rome to avoid being fully absorbed into the province. He managed this with considerable skill. He accepted the status of Rex Socius, allied king, which meant formal independence, preservation of tribal law, the right to rule his own people, in exchange for loyalty and taxes. It was the Roman way of administering buffer zones cheaply. Let the local elite do the work of control, pay them in prestige, and avoid the cost of direct military occupation. Prasutagus was smart enough to know this arrangement would not survive his death. He knew the Romans would come for the kingdom eventually, so he wrote a will. It was, given the circumstances, an act of extraordinary political sophistication. He left half his estate to his two daughters, and half to Emperor Nero himself. By cutting the emperor in on the inheritance, he was essentially bribing Rome into honoring the rest of the will. The message was clear: we give you what you want. In return, protect my family, respect my daughters. Let the Iceni keep something. He died around 60 AD. The Romans ignored every word of it. What happened next is described by Tacitus with a directness that is almost shocking, even by the standards of ancient historical writing. The procurator of Britain, the financial administrator of the province, a man named Catus Decianus, sent his agents into Iceni territory. They were not there to negotiate. They were not there to honor any agreement. They seized the kingdom as if it were conquered territory. They confiscated the estates of the Iceni nobility. They enslaved members of the royal household. They plundered the personal property of the aristocracy. In the logic of Roman imperial administration, what Prasutagus had left to his daughters was irrelevant. Roman law did not recognize female inheritance in this context, and whatever a dying client king had promised was simply not binding on the empire. Then they flogged Boudica. The queen of the Iceni, widow of the king who had spent his entire reign in loyal service to Rome, was publicly beaten like a slave. And her daughters, the two young women Prasutagus had specifically named in his will, the children whose futures he had tried to secure by leaving half his kingdom to the emperor, were raped by Roman soldiers. Tacitus names no individual as having ordered this. He simply reports it as something that happened, as a consequence of Roman policy, of Roman greed, of the casual brutality of an empire that had stopped paying attention to what its agents were doing on the frontier. Catus Decianus, the procurator, was, at minimum, complicit through negligence. At maximum, he authorized it. Within months, he would be fleeing to Gaul, ahead of the storm he had helped create. There is a tendency, in some historical writing, to treat Boudica's revolt as primarily a military or political event, a strategic challenge to Roman control of Britain to be analyzed in terms of troop dispositions and logistical failures. This misses something fundamental. What Catus Decianus's men did to that family was not a policy. It was a crime, and it ignited something that could not be controlled by the normal instruments of imperial management. Boudica was described by Cassius Dio, writing about 150 years after the events, as tall, with a fierce gaze, a harsh voice, and extraordinarily long red hair that fell below her waist. She carried a spear and wore a gold torque around her neck, with a multicolored tunic and a rough cloak fastened at the shoulder. This description has the feel of literary elaboration. Roman writers had very specific ideas about what a barbarian warrior queen should look like. But Tacitus, who is considerably more restrained and precise, also treats her as a serious military commander without any condescension about her gender. She was not a symbol to him. She was a general, a dangerous one. Her name, in the Brittonic language spoken by the tribes of eastern Britain, almost certainly derived from a root meaning victory. The Celts had a tradition of naming children for the qualities they hoped those children would embody. Whether her parents intended it as a prophecy or a wish, Boudica would come extremely close to making the name literal. The scale of what she assembled is staggering. The Iceni were the core, but they were joined almost immediately by the Trinovantes, the tribe whose land had been taken to create the Roman veteran colony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester. The Trinovantes had their own catalogue of grievances. Their sacred city had been seized. Their people had been physically expelled from their homes to make room for retired Roman soldiers who treated them as conquered subjects. A vast temple to the deified Emperor Claudius had been erected in their former capital, an enormous, expensive, permanent monument to Roman supremacy, which the Trinovantes were required to help fund. Roman officials had reportedly called it an altar of eternal domination to their faces. Ancient sources claimed the combined army reached 120,000 warriors. Modern historians generally consider this a significant exaggeration. Standard ancient practice was to inflate enemy numbers to make your eventual victory more impressive. And Tacitus and Cassius Dio were both Roman writers with Roman audiences. The real figure was probably considerably lower, but still represented a force far larger than anything Rome could immediately field against it in Britain. The Iceni, the Trinovantes, and other tribes besides, had united in a way that had no real precedent in the history of Roman occupation. Individual tribal uprisings Rome could handle. This was something different. There was one other crucial factor that made the revolt's timing so dangerous. The man responsible for stopping it was not there. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was the governor of Britain, an experienced, competent, aggressive military commander who had previously distinguished himself in campaigns in North Africa and was known for tackling objectives that other commanders considered too difficult. At the moment the Iceni rose in revolt, he was approximately 400 kilometers away on the island of Mona, today's Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales, conducting a systematic assault on the last major stronghold of the Druids. The Druids were the priestly class of Celtic Britain, the keepers of religious tradition, the men who maintained the connection between the people and their gods, and who had consistently provided spiritual and organizational support to anyone who resisted Roman rule. Rome, usually tolerant of foreign religions, had decided the Druids were a problem too dangerous to ignore. Suetonius had led his army across the Menai Strait in boats and, according to Tacitus, found a terrifying sight on the opposite bank: masked warriors, robed Druids with their arms raised to the sky, and women dressed in black, rushing between the lines like furies, their hair wild, carrying torches. His soldiers were, reportedly, briefly frozen. Then Suetonius ordered them forward. They cut down the Druids, destroyed the sacred groves, and ended in a single campaign what had been the spiritual center of British resistance to Rome. It was probably the most significant strategic success of his governorship. And then the messenger arrived from the east. The Iceni had risen. Camulodunum, the provincial capital, the wealthiest and most symbolically significant Roman city in Britain, was under attack. The 9th Legion, marching to relieve it, had been caught in the open and almost completely destroyed. The infantry were all dead. The legate, Quintus Batilius Cerealis, had escaped with a handful of cavalry. The procurator Catus Decianus, the man whose agents had started this entire catastrophe, had already fled to Gaul. Camulodunum had fallen before Suetonius could intervene. The defenders had taken refuge in the temple of Claudius, the great symbol of Roman power, the altar of eternal domination, and held out for 2 days. Then Boudica's army broke through and burned them alive inside it. The destruction layer at Colchester is, if anything, even more clearly defined than the one beneath London. A thick band of scorched debris, shattered pottery, melted metalwork, carbonized grain, and the occasional human remain, all dating to 60 or 61 AD, sitting directly beneath the modern city. Suetonius left Anglesey immediately. He rode south and east with his cavalry at maximum speed, covering the 400 kilometers through increasingly hostile territory ahead of his infantry, racing to reach Londinium before Boudica's army. He made it. He arrived in the city to find it in barely controlled panic. The news of Camulodunum had preceded him. People knew what had happened to those who sheltered in the temple of Claudius. They knew what had happened to the 9th Legion. They knew Boudica was coming. Suetonius surveyed what he had: his cavalry, some auxiliary units, a city with no walls, no fortifications, no permanent garrison capable of serious resistance. He made the calculation that would define his reputation for the rest of history, and that would seal the fate of everyone in Londinium who could not march with an army. He would not defend the city. He announced that those who could travel should attach themselves to his column and leave immediately. Everyone else, the elderly, the sick, the injured, mothers with infants, the people who simply could not or would not move fast enough, was on their own. Tacitus records that some inhabitants refused to leave even then. Some were too attached to their property to abandon it. Some believed, or needed to believe, that a woman-led army would show some mercy. Some simply had nowhere to go and no way to get there. The Roman column marched out of the city and left them. Within days, Boudica arrived. What happened when Boudica's army entered Londinium is not a matter of historical interpretation. It is a matter of physical evidence lying in the ground. The fire was not accidental. It was not the collateral damage of battle. There was no battle. Suetonius had taken the army and left. What Boudica's warriors found when they crossed into the city was essentially an open, defenseless, populated settlement with no means of resistance whatsoever. What they did with that is recorded both in the written sources and, far more viscerally, in the soil itself. Tacitus is precise about the intent. The Britons were not interested in taking prisoners, not interested in selling captives into slavery, not interested in the normal economics of ancient warfare. They were interested in one thing only. He uses a list that reads like a legal indictment: gibbet, fire, cross. Slaughter by hanging, by burning, by crucifixion. No ransoms, no negotiations, no quarter. The people of Londinium who had stayed behind, and there were thousands of them, were killed. All of them. Cassius Dio, writing roughly 150 years after the events and drawing on sources now lost to us, goes considerably further in his description of what was done to the city's inhabitants, and specifically to its women. His account of the treatment of noble women captured during the sack is so extreme that historians have spent generations debating whether it represents genuine testimony, literary exaggeration for a Roman audience that expected barbarians to behave in monstrous ways, or some combination of both. The details are genuinely difficult to read. Women were publicly mutilated in ways designed to maximize humiliation and suffering, their bodies arranged as offerings to Andraste, the British goddess of victory, whose name translates roughly as the Invincible One, in rituals that Dio frames as religious celebration. Whether or not every detail of his account is accurate, the message is clear. This was not military occupation. This was annihilation as theology. A sacred burning, a human offering, a statement made in blood and fire to a goddess who demanded total victory or nothing at all. The Boudican Destruction Horizon does not lie. Under the modern financial district, the layer of red and black scorched earth runs continuously across an area covering the entire original extent of Roman Londinium. Excavations conducted throughout the 20th century and accelerating dramatically in the post-war period as bomb damage and reconstruction opened up enormous sections of the city's subsoil, revealed that the destruction was uniform. There was no part of Londinium that escaped. The fire consumed the city so completely and so evenly that archaeologists initially struggled to identify it as a single event rather than a series of smaller fires spread over time. The consistency of the dating evidence, coins minted no later than 60 AD, pottery styles that can be pinpointed to the late Neronian period, the complete absence of material from the subsequent decade in the destruction layer itself, eventually made the picture unmistakable. What the fire left behind is, in a strange way, an extraordinary time capsule. When a building burns in an inferno hot enough to vitrify clay and melt glass, it collapses into itself and seals whatever was inside it at the moment of destruction. Grain stores sealed their contents in carbonized form. Shops sealed their inventory, imported wine amphorae from Spain, olive oil from Gaul, fine Samian ware from the pottery workshops of central France. Warehouses sealed their goods. Homes sealed their furniture, their personal objects, their coins. The Boudican fire destroyed Londinium completely. It also, accidentally, preserved a snapshot of what Londinium was at the moment of its destruction, in a way that centuries of gradual decay never could. The writing tablets found at the Bloomberg site in 2013 are the most poignant example. These thin wooden boards, coated with wax and inscribed with a stylus, were the everyday documents of Roman Londinium's commercial life. Most of them are mundane: debt acknowledgements, business agreements, letters about grain prices, complaints about delivery schedules. One, dated to 57 AD, records a loan. Another, from around the same period, mentions a man called Tibullus, a freedman of the emperor, apparently conducting some kind of official business in the city. None of the people who wrote these tablets knew they were living in a city that would cease to exist within a few years. They were doing what people in thriving commercial centers have always done: buying, selling, lending, complaining, making plans. Their plans are gone. Their words survived under the ash. The skulls in the Walbrook are harder to read. More than 100 human skulls were pulled from the bed of this now underground stream over the course of various excavations, and the initial assumption was straightforward. Victims of Boudica, killed during the sack and thrown into the river, their bones separated over time as the current worked on the bodies. Tacitus says explicitly that women and the elderly were particularly reluctant to flee, and that those who remained were killed. The Walbrook ran through the center of Londinium. It made grim, logical sense. Later analysis complicated the picture. Forensic examination of the surviving skulls found that most belonged to young to middle-aged adults, not the profile you would expect if the victims were predominantly the elderly and infirm who couldn't flee. Almost none show the kind of traumatic injury that would be expected from battlefield killing. The bones show signs of having been in the water for a long time, but not necessarily having arrived there at the same moment. Some researchers now argue that the Walbrook skulls accumulated over a longer period, possibly as offerings to the river. The Celts had a strong tradition of depositing objects and human remains in bodies of water as religious acts, and the Romans themselves adopted aspects of this practice. Others maintain that at least some of the skulls are Boudican victims. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The river keeps its secrets. What is not in doubt is what happened to the city above it. Londinium, the magnificent cosmopolitan trading hub that had grown from nothing to a population of tens of thousands in less than 2 decades, was erased. The timeline between Suetonius's departure and Boudica's arrival was almost certainly a matter of days, possibly less. The city had no time to organize any meaningful evacuation beyond what left with the army. Those who could not or did not leave died. Then the city burned. The entire first phase of Londinium's existence, the wooden buildings, the early port facilities, the forum, the shops, the houses, the roads, the entire physical fabric of the settlement, was consumed. But Londinium was only the second city Boudica destroyed. She had already burned one, and she would burn a third before the Romans finally stopped her. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, was the true capital of Roman Britain at the time of the revolt. It was the oldest Roman city in the province, founded as a veteran colony, Colonia Victricensis, where retired legionaries were settled on land confiscated from the local Trinovantes. This was standard Roman practice across the empire. Reward veterans with land grants, build loyalty, create a settled population of fighting men who could serve as a local defense force in an emergency. In practice, in Britain, it had a rather different effect. The veterans of Camulodunum treated the local population with a contempt that bordered on theatrical. Tacitus says they drove people from their homes and called them captives and slaves. They had the support of the law because what they were doing was technically legal. The Trinovantes had no formal rights that the colonists were obliged to respect. But legal and tolerable are very different things. And by 60 AD, the Trinovantes' accumulated grievances had reached a point where the arrival of an Iceni queen promising revenge on Rome was not a hard sell. The centerpiece of Camulodunum was the Temple of the Divine Claudius, a massive structure built to honor the emperor who had ordered the conquest of Britain and been deified after his death. It was enormous, expensive, and deeply offensive to the local population, who were not merely required to tolerate its existence, but to actively contribute to its construction and maintenance costs. For the Trinovantes, it was a symbol of everything the Roman occupation meant: your gods replaced, your money taken, your land gone, your people reduced to funding monuments to the men who conquered you. When Boudica's army arrived outside Camulodunum, there was no significant Roman military force to defend it. The garrison was minimal. A request for help had been sent to the procurator Catus Decianus, who sent 200 inadequately armed men, a gesture so meaningless that it reads less like a military response than a bureaucratic acknowledgement of paperwork. The 9th Legion marched from its base to relieve the city. Boudica's forces ambushed it on the road, destroyed the infantry almost entirely, and drove the legate and his surviving cavalry back in retreat. The people of Camulodunum took refuge in the only stone building in the city, the Temple of Claudius. They held out for 2 days. On the 3rd, Boudica's army broke through and burned it with everyone inside. The destruction layer at Colchester matches the one in London almost exactly. The same profile of scorched debris, the same dates, the same totality of destruction. A Roman helmet found during excavations in Colchester was recovered smashed, deliberately, violently destroyed, not damaged in combat, but destroyed as an act of symbolic annihilation. Someone had specifically targeted the object as a representation of everything they were fighting against and made certain it could never be worn again. After Londinium, Boudica turned her army northwest toward Verulamium, St. Albans, The third city on her list. Verulamium was different from the other two in an important way. It was not a Roman veteran colony. It was a municipium, a chartered town with a significant British population, one that had been granted a degree of self-government and whose leading citizens had access to the Roman legal system. It was, in other words, a town full of Britons who had decided to work with Rome rather than against it. In the brutal mathematics of Boudica's revolt, that made them collaborators. It made them targets. The destruction at Verulamium is archaeologically less dramatic than at London or Colchester. The burn layer is thinner, less consistent, and some researchers argue that the destruction was selective rather than total, focused on the commercial and administrative areas most visibly associated with Roman influence, rather than on ordinary residential districts. Others dispute this interpretation. What is clear is that the city suffered significantly, and that its destruction follows the same basic timeline as the other two sites. Tacitus states the combined death toll across all three cities at 70,000. Cassius Dio pushes the figure to 80,000. Modern historians tend to estimate the actual number at something between 30,000 and 50,000, still one of the most catastrophic episodes of mass killing in the ancient history of the British Isles. Throughout this entire period, the destruction of Colchester, the annihilation of the Ninth Legion, the burning of London, the sack of St. Albans, Suetonius Paulinus was somewhere in the Midlands, refusing to fight. This is the part of the story that tends to get less attention than the dramatic narrative of Boudica's victories, but it is arguably the most important part of the whole episode. Because what Suetonius was doing was not retreating in panic. He was executing a plan. He had one chance to end the revolt, one battle. He could not afford to fight it on ground of Boudica's choosing, with her numbers, with her momentum. He needed to find terrain that would neutralize her greatest advantage, sheer mass of humanity, and maximize his own. Discipline, equipment, training, tactical intelligence. He needed a narrow place. He needed his infantry. He needed every auxiliary unit he could gather, and he needed Boudica to come to him. The Second Augustan Legion, based at Isca Dumnoniorum, modern Exeter, should have been part of his force. Its acting commander, a man called Puinius Posthumus, had received the order to march. For reasons that Tacitus describes but does not fully explain, possibly genuine tactical concerns about leaving the southwest unguarded, possibly simple cowardice, Posthumus did not move. His legion sat at Exeter while the rest of the province burned. When the story of what happened next reached him, Posthumus fell on his own sword. His legion went unmarked, unhonored, while the legions that fought earned eternal distinctions. The shame was apparently unbearable. Without the Second Augusta, Suetonius had around 10,000 men. Against him was an army that ancient sources place at over 100,000, though serious modern estimates suggest the real figure was somewhere between 30 and 80,000. Still, a ratio of at least 3 to 1, and possibly as high as 8 or 10 to 1. He was outnumbered catastrophically by any calculation. He found his narrow place. The exact location remains unknown, and is one of the most debated questions in Roman-British archaeology. Somewhere along or near the road now known as Watling Street, probably in the Midlands, possibly near modern Atherstone in Warwickshire, possibly near High Cross in Leicestershire, possibly somewhere else entirely. No battlefield has ever been conclusively identified. The ground has not given up that secret. What it did give up, at the right moment, was victory. Boudica's army had never lost. It had destroyed 3 cities, annihilated 1 legion, sent a procurator fleeing across the sea, and pushed the Roman governor of the most militarily significant frontier province in the empire to the very edge of the map. Her warriors had been promised Rome's destruction. They had been told the island would be free. They had brought their families to watch. The wagons, carrying wives and children, were arranged behind the battle lines, a gesture of absolute confidence, the kind of thing you do when you are certain you are about to watch history pivot in your direction. They lined up on the wide plain at the mouth of Suetonius's narrow defile. They filled it horizon to horizon. They could not all see the Roman lines from where they stood. The army was too large, the front too wide, the Roman position too confined. But they could hear the war horns. They could feel the ground shake with the collective weight of 100,000 people preparing to move. And then Boudica rode along their ranks on her chariot, her daughters beside her. And she said what needed to be said. Tacitus gives her a speech. He was not there, and neither was anyone who reported directly to him, though his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, was serving in Britain at the time as a military tribune and may have passed on accounts. The speech, as rendered by Tacitus, cuts to the heart of everything the revolt was about. This is not about a kingdom. This is not about money or land or political arrangements. This is about what was done to my body, to my daughters, to my people. Win or die. There is no third option. Suetonius also gave a speech, reported by Tacitus in a register so different from Boudica's that the contrast feels deliberate. Where she speaks in terms of honor and vengeance and divine justice, he speaks in terms of professional technique. Ignore the noise. Trust your training. Watch your intervals. When they charge into the defile, throw your pila on my signal, then push forward in wedge formation. Use your shields as battering rams. Kill with your swords. There will be more women than fighting men in their ranks. After the victory, everything is yours. He was right about the women. He was right about almost everything else, too. The battle had not yet begun, but the man who had abandoned London without a fight had, in that abandonment, already made the choice that would save the province. The Britons charged. The charge of Boudica's army was, by any measure, one of the most terrifying things a Roman soldier had ever been asked to stand and watch approach. Ancient warfare was fundamentally psychological before it was physical. The side that broke first, that turned and ran before contact, almost always lost. The Romans had spent generations engineering a military culture specifically designed to prevent that breaking point. Discipline, training, the cohesion of the contubernium, the 8-man tent group that ate together, slept together, marched together, and fought together. All of it existed to make the moment when 100,000 people screaming war cries came running across an open field into something a man could survive psychologically long enough to fight. Suetonius had chosen his ground with extraordinary care. Tacitus describes it precisely enough that generations of historians have used the description as a kind of archaeological treasure map, searching the Midlands for terrain that matches. A narrow pass or defile opening into a plain with dense forest directly behind the Roman position. The forest served two purposes. It prevented any possibility of a flanking attack or encirclement from the rear. Boudica's army would have to come through the front, through the narrowing ground, and it would have to do so on terms entirely dictated by the man waiting for it. And it gave the Roman troops psychological security. Nothing was behind them. There was no direction from which surprise could come. There was only forward, and forward was where the enemy was, and the enemy was doing exactly what Suetonius needed it to do. The Britons charged into the narrowing defile in a mass. This was the decisive structural error of the entire revolt, not a tactical mistake in the narrow sense, but a consequence of the fundamental difference between a tribal army and a professional one. A tribal army fights by weight and emotion. You gather your people, You work them into a shared fury. You unleash them at the enemy and trust that the collective force of your numbers will overwhelm whatever stands in your way. It had worked at Camulodunum. It had worked against the 9th Legion. It had worked everywhere Boudica had fought. Mass, momentum, rage. These were her weapons. In an open field against a smaller force, they would have worked again. 10,000 Romans in the open, surrounded on all sides by 80,000 Britons, would have been rolled over and destroyed. The numbers were simply too asymmetrical. But Suetonius's pass meant that only a fraction of Boudica's army could engage at any given moment. The mass compressed. The warriors pressing forward from the rear pushed those in the front into an increasingly confined space. Long Celtic swords require room to swing, a full lateral sweep, a raised arm downstroke, the kind of movement that depends on having empty air to your left and right. In the crush of the defile, there was no empty air. The swords became useless. The warriors at the front were dying on Roman short blades. The gladius, perfectly adapted for exactly this kind of tight press, thrust forward between shields in a confined space, again and again. No room needed, no winding up, just controlled, repetitive killing at arm's length. The Roman pila, the heavy javelins that legionaries threw in coordinated volleys just before contact, had already done their work. Pila were specifically engineered to be impossible to remove from a shield once embedded. The soft iron shaft bent on impact, locking the javelin in place and dragging the shield down, making it nearly impossible to use. The warriors who had survived the volley were now fighting half-blinded, off-balance, pushed from behind by thousands of people who could not see what was happening at the front into a Roman line that had not moved. Then Suetonius ordered the wedge. The Roman wedge formation, cuneus, was the killing stroke of a battle already won. The legionaries had been standing in tight, ordered ranks, absorbing the charge, grinding down the Britons in the crush. Now they began to advance, not in a line, but in a triangular formation, the point driving forward into the increasingly disorganized mass of warriors in front of them, splitting it, driving through it, the widening body of the wedge pushing the separated groups to either side where the auxiliary infantry on the flanks could deal with them. The cavalry, positioned on the wings, swept outward to prevent any breakout. The Britons tried to fall back. This is where the wagons killed them. Boudica had lined the battle with the wagons carrying her people's families. Wives, children, relatives come to watch the victory, arranged in a great arc behind the army. It was a statement of certainty, a gesture of absolute confidence in the outcome. Now it became a wall. The warriors retreating from the advancing Roman wedge ran into their own wagons. Horses panicked, wagons overturned. The press of bodies from the front met the immovable barrier of the wagons from behind, and the result was catastrophic compression. People trampling people, the wounded going down under the feet of those trying to flee, no direction to move that wasn't blocked by either Romans or family. The slaughter that followed is recorded in numbers that ancient sources cannot be fully trusted to report accurately, but that archaeological evidence suggests were genuinely catastrophic. Tacitus gives a figure of 80,000 Britons killed. Cassius Dio gives a similar number. Roman losses, according to Tacitus, were 400 dead and a somewhat larger number wounded. Modern historians universally treat the Roman casualty figure as too low, and the British figure as probably too high, but accept that the battle was utterly one-sided. When a professional army of disciplined heavy infantry fights a disorganized tribal force in terrain specifically chosen to neutralize the tribal force's numerical advantage, the outcome tends toward massacre rather than battle in the conventional sense. The Romans did not stop at the edge of the British line. They pursued. They killed the warriors. They killed the families in the wagons. Tacitus records specifically that even draft animals were killed, their bodies added to the heap of the dead, so that there would be no confusion later about the completeness of the victory. Boudica escaped the battlefield, for a time. What happened to her after the rout is one of the genuinely unresolvable mysteries of Roman-British history. Tacitus says she took poison. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died. These two accounts are not necessarily contradictory. A woman who had just watched everything she built destroyed in a single afternoon might have chosen to end her life rather than face Roman captivity. And illness could be Dio's polite euphemism, or a separate tradition about the same event. Neither source knows with certainty. Neither was there. What is certain is that she died in the weeks immediately following the battle, probably somewhere in the Eastern Midlands, or the region she had controlled, and that her body was given an honorable burial. Tacitus implies this, somewhere that has never been found. The location of her grave is another unsolvable puzzle, and the absence of resolution has given rise to the kind of legend that fills vacuums left by history. The most persistent of these holds that Boudica is buried under Platform 10 of King's Cross Station in London. This is almost certainly not true, and has no serious archaeological or historical support. But there is something that feels right about it, or at least something that feels like a kind of justice. The greatest rebel in the history of Roman Britain, possibly lying under the most frantically busy transit hub in the country she tried to free, with millions of people rushing over her every day without knowing it. The Roman response to the battle's aftermath divided sharply between the military and the political. Suetonius Paulinus, the man who had abandoned London and then won the battle that saved the province, moved immediately into systematic reprisal operations. He was a soldier. He understood victory as a military concept, and military victory in the ancient world meant punishing resistance so thoroughly that nobody would consider repeating it. His forces swept through the territories of the participating tribes, burning settlements, killing those who had fought and those who had sheltered those who had fought, taking slaves. Famine compounded the destruction. Boudica's army had not planted crops in the year of the revolt, had consumed everything they found on their march, and had stripped the agricultural capacity of a wide area. The winter after the battle saw starvation alongside military repression across eastern Britain. The new procurator, Gaius Julius Alpinus Classicianus, arrived from Rome and immediately began sending reports back that alarmed the imperial administration. His predecessor, Catus Decianus, the man whose agents had flogged the queen and raped her daughters, the man who had triggered the entire catastrophe, had already disappeared into comfortable obscurity in Gaul. Classicianus was a different kind of official, competent, pragmatic, and able to see past the military logic of reprisals to the political reality they were creating. A province full of traumatized, starving, furious people whose survivors were being systematically killed was not a province. It was an insurgency in waiting. He wrote to Rome. He said specifically, according to Tacitus, that the province would never return to peace as long as Suetonius was governing it. He did not attack Suetonius's military record. The victory at Watling Street had made that impossible. He attacked the policy. The punishment operations were self-defeating. They were creating more enemies than they were destroying. And if the goal was a stable, tax-producing province, continued repression was the wrong tool. Nero sent a freedman named Polyclitus to investigate. The investigation found in Classicianus's favor. Suetonius, the man who had saved Britain, was quietly replaced by a more conciliatory governor, Publius Petronius Turpilianus, whose instructions were essentially to stop killing people and start rebuilding. This sequence of events is worth dwelling on, because it represents something genuinely surprising about how the Roman imperial system could function at its best. the administrative capacity to recognize that military victory and political stability are not the same thing, and to replace the instrument of one with the instrument of the other without ceremony or apparent resentment. Suetonius disappeared from the historical record after his recall. He had saved the province and was thanked for it by being removed. This is not obviously unjust. He was the right man for the crisis and the wrong man for the peace, and Rome knew the difference. The 14th Legion received the title Martia Victrix, martial and victorious. Nero declared its soldiers the finest in the empire. The 20th Legion received the title Valeria Victrix. The 9th Legion, savaged in the ambush during the opening stages of the revolt and further depleted in the battle, rebuilt painfully and eventually recovered enough to be posted to the Rhine, and later, possibly, to disappear somewhere in the north of Britain in circumstances that remain mysterious. The 2nd Augustan Legion, whose acting commander, Poenius Postumus, had refused to march and subsequently killed himself, received nothing. It remained plain 2nd Augusta for the rest of its existence. In the honors system of the Roman army, that silence was its own kind of monument to shame. Londinium was rebuilt almost immediately. The evidence is striking. Writing tablets found at the Bloomberg site include documents dated to 62 AD, within 1 or 2 years of the destruction, that record active commercial relationships between London and St. Albans. The city was not merely resettled, it was reorganized and rebuilt on a more ambitious scale than before. The new Londinium was built in stone rather than wood. A massive new forum was constructed, the largest public square north of the Alps. A basilica, baths, an amphitheater capable of holding 7,000 spectators, temples to various gods. The port was entirely rebuilt, with more sophisticated timber wharfs. By the middle of the 2nd century, Londinium's population had reached approximately 60,000, larger than it had ever been before the fire. And it had become the de facto capital of the province, the seat of the governor, the center of the financial administration, the hub through which the wealth of Britannia flowed. Sometime between 190 and 225 AD, the Romans built the London Wall, a defensive circuit roughly 3 kilometers long, 6 meters high, 2.5 meters thick, enclosing an area of about 130 hectares. Sections of this wall survive to this day, at Tower Hill, at the Barbican, in several other locations scattered through the modern city. The wall defined the boundaries of the historic City of London, the square mile, for well over a millennium after the Romans left. The outline of a city that no longer existed kept shaping the city that replaced it, generation after generation. The ghost of Londinium haunting every map and property boundary and street line down to the present. The Boudican Revolt forced Rome to fundamentally reconsider how it managed Britain. The disaster had not been military. Rome's military had ultimately performed precisely as it was supposed to. The disaster had been administrative. The procurator's decision to ignore a dying king's will, to confiscate instead of negotiate, to brutalize instead of manage, had turned a routine succession problem into a catastrophic provincial revolt at enormous cost. The lesson Rome took from this was not uniformly applied across the empire. Roman provincial administration remained capable of extraordinary greed and cruelty in many contexts. But in Britain specifically, the period following the revolt saw a conscious shift toward more careful management of client relationships, more attention to local political sensitivities, and a recognition that certain kinds of provocation carried costs that outweighed any short-term gains. Boudica herself entered legend almost immediately, but a Roman legend, which is to say a legend shaped by the people who defeated her. Tacitus treats her with genuine respect. He gives her the best speeches. He makes her cause comprehensible, even sympathetic. He does not pretend her grievances were invented. He understands that what Catus Decianus's men did was wrong. But he is writing ultimately as a Roman, and the arc of his narrative bends toward the validation of Roman order. The revolt happened. It was catastrophic. It was ended by Roman discipline and Roman intelligence, and the province continued. Order was restored. The machine kept running. The machine ran for another 3.5 centuries. The last Roman troops left Britain around 410 AD, recalled to defend the continental empire against pressures that would eventually destroy it. By then, Londinium had existed for nearly 370 years, longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The wall they left behind kept defining the city long after they were gone. The roads they built kept being used. The place they had chosen, for purely practical reasons of river crossing and road logistics, kept being a city, kept growing, kept pulling people from every direction into its gravitational field. And underneath it all, that layer of scorched red earth. 10 to 30 centimeters of ash and burned debris and melted glass and carbonized grain and the odd human bone running under the foundations of the banks and the trading floors and the glass towers. Every time a developer sinks a new foundation into the City of London, archaeologists arrive and document the layer before the concrete covers it again. The Boudican Destruction Horizon. A woman's signature, burned into the bedrock of the most important financial city on Earth. She burned it because Rome deserved to burn. She almost drove Rome from the island entirely. She failed by the length of one narrow pass in the Midlands, on a day whose exact date is unknown, in a place whose exact location has never been found. She lost the battle. She won something else entirely. Her name survived when the names of the governors who replaced Suetonius did not. Her face was cast in bronze and placed on Westminster Bridge, directly opposite the Houses of Parliament, in 1902. The warrior queen who burned London, given pride of place at the heart of the city she destroyed. The inscription on the base of the statue does not mention the Romans. It does not mention the defeat. It says only, Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, as if the story ended there, at the peak of it, before Watling Street, before the wagons, before the Roman wedge, as if she won. Maybe, in the only way that ultimately matters, she did.